So the reason for running these workshops is because I see the struggles that people have when it comes to making wills and lasting powers of attorney. So not knowing how to go about it. And sometimes people not seeing the importance of doing it. And that can often mean that there are lots of difficulties when it comes to the people, the loved ones that are left behind. And it can have, in some situations, some really devastating, a devastating impact. So I wanted really to break this down, find a way of overcoming the struggles. And as I say, break it down, make it easy to put these protections into place. And that was my aim for this workshop. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk through the different areas. So that leads me to my first question. And I'm hoping you can all see my slides on the screen. So if not, let me know. But hopefully everybody can see that. Oh, so, thank you very much. Somebody's just confirmed we can see them. That's great. Thanks, Chucks. So that leads me to my first question. Again, let me know in the chat. Do you know what a will and lasting power of attorney is? So let me know in the chat if you do. And even, have you made a will before? Perhaps it is something that you've made before as well. Let me know also. So we've got lots of yeses. Brilliant. And yeah, yes to both. Oh, that's encouraging that particularly with powers of attorney, that you know what they are. So yeah, some great points coming in with the distinction between the two and the difference. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on. So thanks for that, everybody. So I'm just getting my slides to work. My aim for this workshop is to provide as much information guidance as I possibly can. I will introduce my how to protect your assets and loved ones process. So I'll talk about the process that I'm going to be sharing in this workshop today. And also there will be an opportunity to ask any questions. So any questions you like, put them in the chat for me once again. If you want to ask a question, if there's something that comes up during the workshop as we move along, if you put in the chat, if it's a question, just a Q next to it, and then I can pick it up. So I will come back and answer any questions at the end. We'll have some time to do that. So that's my aim for the workshop today. Now, over the years, and after about 16 years of helping people, assisting clients with making wills and powers of attorney, with estate planning, with probate, whatever it is. So having, helped, thousands even, actually, I mentioned hundreds of clients, possibly thousands of clients over those 16 years, but particularly over the last 18 months. And that was when I became a self-employed consultant solicitor. I noticed, why people were struggling with making wills and powers of attorney and why they were failing to do that. And there were some common reasons, and 5 main reasons I identified. And I'll go through these now. So the first one was they would think they have plenty of time to make a will, make a lasting power of attorney. And in some cases, it would be too late. So it's not prioritized. It's not put on our, or perhaps it's put on our to-do list, but it's not at the top. And unfortunately, we don't know when it's going to happen. Tomorrow isn't guaranteed for any of us. I think sometimes there can be a misconception that this is a will, a power of attorney, something we do in later life. I think also with a power of attorney, that people often think that it's only when perhaps you have dementia, which typically happens in later life, but not always. You know, it can be something which happens at a lot younger age, but also we could get ill at any point. And then the second point I identified was starting to make the wills and powers of attorney, but not finishing them. So often clients would say, "Oh, I've made the start. I've got some drafts, and that's great. I'm all covered." But they're actually useless unless they are finished. So in order to be legally binding, wills and powers of attorney do need to be finished. And the third point is not discussing with anyone what they would like to happen when they die and become ill. And I think partly that is due to the fear of discussing death. So I think in society we do deny death, and it's a bit of a taboo subject. So we don't have those conversations, and that stops us from making our wills and powers of attorney, but also it stops us from really being able to tell our loved ones, well, what do we want to happen? You know, when I'm gone, do you really know what my wishes are? The fourth point is not, I mentioned this earlier, not appreciating how important a will and lasting power of attorney is. And that feeds into the fifth point, which is they think it's simple and just a document that needs to be written. So they don't get help or attempt to do it themselves. So often there are DIY options, but that doesn't give the opportunity to really tailor it to you. And you know, this idea of it being simple, there is a lot to think about, but that's to actually make sure that your loved ones know what your wishes are, but it is right for you. So you need the will and you need the power of attorney to do exactly what you need it to do. And what I would love to know, and what I would like you to do, again, in the chat box for me, is just have a think about which one of those 5 points that you relate to. I mean, it might be one of them, it might be a few, it could even be all of them. But I'd love to know which one are you struggling with right now of those 5 points. Let me know in the chat. I'd really love to know. And we've got a few coming in already. So that's fantastic. We've got a 1. Okay. Yeah, good point. Good point. And I'll actually be covering through the content in the workshop all of these points. So we've got a 2 coming in. Procrastination, yeah, absolutely. Some 3s and 4s, yeah, interesting. Quite a range there. So thank you for that, everybody. Okay, so the overview of this session today, I've broken it down into 3 distinct sections, and we'll look at each section in more detail. So the first section is protection. So that's how we get started with all of this. You know, where exactly do we start? And this is the part that we really need to focus on. You know, this is the key element. And then in part 2, we'll look at support. So that's how do we get it right for our own individual circumstances? And that's another key point. And also make sure that we get the correct advice for us. And then in the final part, decisions, that's how we do it, how we actually get it done and make sure that we have these protections in place and get it off our to-do list and make sure it is prioritized. Okay. So just very briefly, I wanted to just say a little bit about me. So who am I? So I'll just do this very briefly. So consultant solicitor at Richard Nelson Solicitors, which I joined actually 2 years ago. I became a self-employed consultant. and been working within legal firms for, I mentioned earlier, oh, goodness me, about 16 years in total. And I'm on a bit of a mission to raise awareness for wills and powers of attorney and making sure that everybody has these protections in place. So when they become ill and when we pass away. And throughout the session, I'll talk through how I've helped clients and also share examples, which they've all come from the discussions I've had and my experience of helping clients with wills and lasting powers of attorney. If we are not already connected on LinkedIn, do connect with me. So there's a QR code there you can use to connect with me on LinkedIn. I suspect most of you on this session today, we are already connected, but just in case we're not, then you can do that through the QR code. So do connect with me as opposed to just following. So it'd be great. It'd be great to connect. Before I move into the in-depth content then for this session, I wanted to address why I have a lasting power of attorney and a will. So why should we be focusing on this now? You know, why, particularly during these challenging times? Well, there are three main reasons: to protect your loved ones, so your family, your partner, whoever you class as your family, those closest to you; to protect your money and property, so your savings, could be personal effects even as well, but also to protect your income, finances, and your business if you have a business. And in truth, there are lots of different reasons, and we'll touch upon in the in-depth content later in the workshop some more of those specific reasons. But these are the three main reasons. It's useful here just to pause and reflect on the difference between the will and lasting power of attorney, which we touched upon earlier at the beginning of the session. So a will is, as you may know already, it's dealing with, well, this is what I want to happen when I pass away. The power of attorney then is, this is what I would like to happen if I become ill, if I can't make my own decisions. So it's having the right people who can make decisions for us. And that might be related to our finances, our business, could be our health, our welfare. So it does cover a lot of different things. And we could die with no protections in place, and that's the truth, and that's what we are wanting to avoid. We want to make sure ultimately that our money, our property, our assets, you know, they will go to who we want them to go to and not to somebody else. You know, if we own a business, there's another example, we don't want that to come grinding to a halt, which could mean a loss of income and ultimately a loss of business. And also, if we become ill, I mentioned a moment ago, the decisions that we need to be able to make about our health, about our finances, and it could be simple things like running the house, running our property, making sure we have somewhere to live, and any medical decisions and care decisions. But also, it's to give security to those we leave behind as well. You know, we want to make sure that they are protected, that they are safe. You know, they know what we would like, and they feel, you know, as much as possible comfortable, and they can grieve. You know, that they have the space to grieve without worrying about, well, with you know, with my relative I've lost, they haven't done this, we need to sort this out. And more importantly, who will look after the pets? So who are the right people who are going to look after our pets if we have any? Actually, in the chat, let me know if you do have a pet. And in fact, one of the reasons why I update my will quite regularly is because to cater for the pets, to make sure that the right people are there. to look after them. So a really important part of the process if you are an animal lover. So making sure that those pets are catered for. But if we don't have a will and a power of attorney, then we are leaving it to chance. It's not just the pets, it's absolutely everything. And this is what happens if we don't have a will. So you can see it really is complicated. So I'm not going to spend any more time on that diagram. It is quite confusing, but it just shows that it is complicated and what can happen if we don't have a will in place. So how do we get started with all of this, and what do we need to do? What do we need to put all of this in place? And this is an area that the majority don't do. And the majority don't take these steps. And I've noticed that this happens all the time when I'm helping clients with wills and powers of attorney. So to plan, which is the first step, to have those important conversations. So those conversations about dying in ill health. And then also to actually make a decision and do it, and to get it all done. And planning is a really key part. And I mentioned this earlier, that most think that wills and powers of attorney, they are easy to do, simple to do, we might be able to do that ourselves. They're just this document that we know we should have. But it's important to give it some context. And part of that, and certainly initially part of this planning, is thinking about, well, what assets do I have? What liabilities do I have? What personal possessions do I have? The pets as well. Don't forget the pets. And then also thinking about the family tree. So this is giving it context to your individual circumstances. And I did realize this, in all honesty, only a few years ago, again, since becoming a self-employed consultant solicitor, this idea that it is so much more than just this legal document that we know we should have. It's almost a living document, and that's true of the powers of attorney, but it's also true of the will. So it is thinking about, well, okay, what do I need to make sure that this will is going to do what I need it to do? And it's making those wishes known in tangible form. So recording those wishes and thinking about and recording, well, what do our loved ones want to know? What do they need to know? And also our business partners, if we do have a business. And this was important to John Paul and Ben. So I mentioned earlier, I'll share some stories from clients I've helped. And just to say as well, so John Paul and Ben, they're not their real clients' names. Obviously, I can't mention for confidentiality reasons, but these are examples from clients I've helped, and typically, from a number of clients that I've helped with their wills and lasting powers of attorney, and some of the key issues that do come up. So with John Paul and Ben, they had actually started to get these protections in place, but they had got stuck, and partly was because there was lots going on for them. So there were conflicting concerns, and they also needed a certificate provider for a power of attorney. So this is an element of doing a power of attorney where you need someone to be able to say you understand what you're doing and almost sign it off. And because they'd started to do this, they've been giving this some thought, but they had got a bit stuck. And John Paul and Ben, they had various personal possessions which were really important. They had assets, they had a home, but the home was just in John Paul's name, and that was the property they lived in. They actually had some business interest, but that was almost like a hobby. So they had retired, so they had an income stream coming in, and they needed to make sure that that was catered for. There was concerns about, well, what's going to happen to Ben if John Paul became ill or needed care in the future. So because the property was just in his sole name, and they wanted to express, well, if I do become ill, I need my power of attorney to really speak to the people, my loved ones, those around me. And they needed that to be talked about and recorded. So the certificate provider is part of the power of attorney I mentioned earlier. So that was another important aspect. So we worked together to record who would manage all of the business interests. They had the correct people to deal with their personal effects. That was really important. I think personal effects are important for a lot of people because they can cause lots of arguments, ironically. So it's important to get that part right and have the conversations about how can you distribute your assets so there are no arguments, how you're going to do that legally, but also practically. And that's sometimes where there is a challenge. And we also work together to set out, well, what do they both want? If John Paul does become ill, or in fact, if Ben became ill, what do they want? How do they want to be cared for? And I acted as the certificate provider as well, which is what I do when I make powers of attorney, and it relieves the stress of having to find a certificate provider, so someone who can understand the power of attorney, but also to be able to say legally, well, John Paul and Ben, they understand what a power of attorney is, what that means for them, and that's part of what I do when I'm assisting clients with powers of attorney. And once all this was done, they knew then that the assets were secure. So they'd set out exactly in the will, this is what I would like to happen. We'd also made use of a letter of wishes, which is a separate document, which goes alongside a will, which can record all this other information and wishes as well. And they had that peace of mind. And really importantly, peace of mind for Ben, because of the fact that the property was in John Paul's sole name. Now, the second area that the majority don't do, and I notice this all the time again, it is having those important conversations. I talked earlier about death being a taboo subject. And interestingly, I think it is for us in the UK a societal issue. In other cultures, it is approached very differently. And I listened to something very, very recently, which was talking about how different cultures dealt with grief and how they would go and have this set period of time that they would grieve. But it would be, for the want of a better word, full on grief. They were allowing it to happen. In the idea being that, once that time period had elapsed, they then could have some peace. They then could move on with their life. And I think that happens sometimes with us. I think we do get very busy when we lose somebody. And, that can sometimes be very difficult for everybody. But what this means by not having these conversations as well is we don't have the tools to deal with it when it does happen to somebody close to us. And that can cause some stress for the people who are dying around us. They may want to start to have conversations, but it's ultimately better if we can have those in advance. And death is going to happen to all of us. It is something we all have in common. It is guaranteed. One of only a few certainties in life. And not having these conversations, it does prevent us from making a will and a lasting power of attorney. And this is what happened to me. And so this photo was actually taken quite a few years ago now, but I had reached a certain age where I really began to think about this question and start to engage with death. And again, in all honesty, it's not something I particularly considered during the time I've been working with clients, and considering what I do, was a bit of a surprise. But when I actually started to think, one day I'm going to pass away, and start to engage with death, it helped me to live well, to really think about, well, what's truly important to me in life, what brings me joy. And if we have those conversations about dying, about ill health, we can tap into that and live our best life. And it also gives us courage. Part of this for me was the fact that I did move into self-employment. And again, that was a reaction to working out, well, what did I really want to do, knowing that life is short and we only have one life. And that did coincide with the events of the world over the last few years. But it really gave me the courage to, make the move to self-employment. And also I began to realize so for me, and also when I was discussing this with clients and seeing their transformation almost, that it began to connect them more with their loved ones. So again, they were not worrying about, well, what's going to happen, because they were having these conversations. And I think it is an interesting subject to talk about. Once we do start talking about it, it can go off in all sorts of different areas. And from time to time, it's a good subject to bring to the dinner table. And these are just a few pictures of some of the things I've been doing since becoming self-employed. So, this was really driven by engaging with death, thinking about, what I really wanted, and also how that related to, making my will and power attorney and making sure that they were updated when things changed. So with these conversations, it's important to slow down, reflect on what we really want, let's give ourselves permission to talk about it to those closest to us. But if you're not comfortable with that, it could be somebody else, a friend or a professional, when we're making our wills and powers of attorney. We must talk openly about death. And then we must protect those that we leave behind, so we are not having any regrets when we pass away. So the third element to this, so from part one, is actually making the decision. So when we get these two things right, our planning and having those important conversations, it gets easier to be able to get it done. And it all comes together. So you and your loved ones, we know what to do because we've talked about it. You know how to get started. We're putting these protections in place, what you will need to do and how to approach it, because you've been through the planning exercise. And this is what I helped Sandra with. So another example from helping clients. And again, Sandra's not the real name, just to say that, again, for confidentiality reasons. But for Sandra, she actually needed to update her will and make a power of attorney. And her situation was, so she was looking to actually downsize. And there was a real concern about burdening, in Sandra's case, her two friends, who she actually wanted to be her executors and attorneys in the power of attorney. So she didn't have close family members. Her friends were her family. But this idea of burdening them really was playing on her mind. So we were able to have the conversations with all three of them. So it wasn't just with Sandra, it was actually involving everybody who were going to be involved with the will and power of attorney, because the friends needed that guidance as well. And if we're able to record it, then we know that this is what they'll be happy with. You know, this is, again, this is what we would like to happen. And they understood exactly what it meant to be an attorney under the power of attorney, what it meant to be an executor. And then together we were able to work out this plan. You know, so there was no longer this worry that her friends would be burdened. If you'd like a chance to speak to me at the end, I'm actually going to be offering some sessions, so a chance to speak to me, and we'll talk through creating your plan, who to have the conversations with, so we can get clarity about your own situation. And as I say, it's going to be about creating your plan so we can get these protections in place. So at the end, I'll talk a little bit more about that. There is a QR code there actually where you can book in a session. So again, you can use the QR code, just point your camera at the screen to book in, and that'll take you through to a link to a bookings page. So my top tips then for the first section, protection. So give some context to the will and power of attorney. Key step. Think about, well, what I'm doing, this is more than a legal document. This is a living document. And we are going to update it realistically in the future. You know, things will change. But also engage with death. Let's start having those conversations. But also decide to do it. Make the actual decision. Well, okay, I'm going to take action, which, you know, most people don't, certainly from my experience. So that's part one. So I'll just give you a moment, just to take a sip of water, just to reflect on what I've been talking about during part one. Hopefully that's been useful. It's an important starting point to make sure that you get the correct advice for you. So again, for your own circumstances. And the wills and powers of attorney, they need to do what you want them to do. And this is what part two is all about. So it's focusing in on what you need to do to get them tailored for you, and then putting everything in place. And there's two elements we need to do for this. And the first is implementation. So we have to implement. And the second is communication and action. And I'm going to have a look at implementing first, because there are two elements to implementing. And that's a deep dive. And then the second is to get help. So what do we mean by deep dive then? So, I mean, this is again, going back to the planning point, but it is really getting clear and focusing in on why. So why do we want to have a will and lasting power of attorney? Why is quite a popular concept. You've probably come across it. You know, we all seem to talk about why. What's our individual why in terms of what we do in our careers and our professional lives? It's really important for will and power of attorney. And I began to notice that people were making wills and powers of attorney because there was something going on in their life which was motivating them to do it. So there was always that reason why they were wanting to get it done. And I mentioned at the start the three main reasons, and I'd expand upon that. And these are some of the reasons why we are actually going to be motivated. So it might be protection again for our partner, children, and business. And I'll give an example. So, you know, I help lots of clients where they have children from a previous relationship, but they have a new partner. So they need to balance the two. It might be that somebody's unmarried or not in a civil partnership. Divorce. Somebody is, I often help clients where they are going through a divorce. They need to make sure that their assets are passing to who they want them to and not to a soon-to-be ex-partner. Saving tax, thinking about, well, what inheritance tax issues might there be? Also, do I need to exclude somebody from the will? We often see in the news, a lot of stories about people challenging wills because they feel that they should have been included and they haven't been. And often that's because of a difficult relationship. They're not getting on with their families. And there's just some more examples here of people I've helped with this. And as I mentioned earlier, there is a motivating factor. Having a new relationship is another one. We might want to think about care costs in the future. There are so many people who do think about care costs. And again, something you may have seen in the news, how we pay for care in later life, and the rules surrounding that and the changes that various governments have tried to bring. So it is quite a topical subject and people really do think about that. But it's important just to perhaps reflect here and just note that, care costs can come about at any age. It's not just about later life. It could be that we have an accident. It could be that we have early onset dementia, which does happen. And I've seen with some of the clients I've helped. And there's a few there on the slides I've mentioned earlier. So making sure the assets go to the correct people. It also helps us to actually organize our finances. So it helps us with financial well-being. And it gives us that security and peace of mind again. And that's really important for lots of clients I help with wills, and they always say that to me. So we really want to focus on our why. Why are we doing the will? Why are we doing the power of attorney? We want to make sure to a degree that there is some control over what happens. And you'll remember this diagram from earlier. And that's what we're ultimately trying to avoid. The second element to this is getting help. And this is where most think they can do it themselves and perhaps even take the substandard option. So I'm sure you may have come across advertisements for wills for £20, the DIY kits that we can get. There are lots of options. And I think, unfortunately, that's where we miss out the planning options and to really be able to tailor it to us, but also to get it right. We want to make sure that it's legally binding and it does what we need it to do. And then people also speak with friends and family who have done it before, or they ask Google, and I know we all do it. I'm guilty of this as well. We do go to Google for lots of information. And that's okay to an extent, but the problem is it does result in the wrong advice. So it's not advice for us. It's advice which is going to be very generic. So our family and friends are going to have very different circumstances. But also advice may get misinterpreted. So things often perhaps don't, when we're talking about it with friends and family, it doesn't necessarily translate into the correct advice because sometimes it may have been misinterpreted. So we don't want it to be generic. It is about a personalized service. It's very much being tailored to you. It's a will, power of attorney. They're not off-the-shelf products. Otherwise, there is no point in doing them. And if we think about it, making a will is the most important legal service we will ever use. And that's because it is about our life, protecting those around us, protecting our assets, our business if we have one. And all those things I mentioned earlier, one of the key legal services that we will all need at some point. And it is about making sure they are legally correct. So we need that legal advice to steer us in the right direction. Again, make sure that they do what we need to. And not just this document. So without the legal advice, they are worthless. They need that context. And when we don't get help, this can be when it all goes wrong. And I wanted to share another story, again, not a client's real name, examples of clients I've helped in the past. So for Tim, this was a DIY will. So we'd gone down the DIY route. So one of those legal packs, we probably may have seen them. And what had actually happened is the correct formalities for making a will, so for signing and witnessing a will, hadn't been followed. So there are certain legal requirements. So because they were wrong, the will wasn't legally binding. And why that was such an issue for Tim was because he wanted to leave his house, his property, to a friend. But because the will was invalid, it then went to the rules, that diagram from earlier. That sets out what happens if you don't have a will or your will is invalid. And in Tim's case, that went to family members who are actually distant relatives. So he didn't have contact with them. They were very distant relatives. And that's what can happen with the rules. So they're called the intestacy rules when we don't have a will or if we have an invalid will. And this is an area which also happened to Mike and his father, again, not client's real name, but this related to the powers of attorney. And again, it was a DIY approach. And, they wanted to make both types of powers of attorney. So the finance, we have, and then also one for health and welfare decisions. And they really wanted to get this done. And by the time they decided to do it, Mike's father had dementia, but it was worsening. And Mike needed to be able to make decisions for his father. So about finances, about care. So things like accessing bank accounts, making those important medical decisions, those care decisions, and actually to make his father comfortable. And because of his father's dementia, his mental capacity was in doubt. So by that, I mean, if we do have an illness which is affecting our decision-making ability, then we may not have mental capacity under the law to be able to make decisions, and in particular, in this case, to make a power of attorney. So may not be able to make one. And actually what happened, I helped Mike and his father to make the power of attorney. I actually helped to arrange a mental capacity assessment, which could then support the making of the power of attorney. So somebody could assess Mike's father so the power of attorney could actually be completed. So Mike was then able to help his dad with his finances, pay the care bills, help him access finances, make him comfortable. And what can also happen when we don't have a power of attorney is we are then relying on the court of protection So if we do reach the stage, like Mike's father, where we don't have mental capacity to make a power of attorney, we could go to the court of protection, which is the equivalent to a power of attorney where somebody has lost mental capacity. So we can make sure that somebody can make decisions for them. But that takes time. It does leave us in limbo, or leaves the family members in limbo, because going through the court of protection takes a long time. I think the ones I've been doing recently, they're taking 4 months, in some cases longer, because there is a process, another process to follow, and it takes a long time, much more so than preparing and making the powers of attorney in advance. And the other element to this is, so I mentioned earlier, 2 things we need to do is our implementation and our planning, and then our communication and action. So with communication and action, instead of speaking with people, asking Google for that information, getting that generic advice, if we can spend some time writing out a list of questions which are important to you. So what do we need? Sorry, what do you need to know? What are the important things to you? And spend a short amount of time doing that. And this is what I helped Jill with, another client example, again, not client's real name. But I sent Jill a checklist of specific points to consider. And the idea was to draw out all of the information so we could tailor the advice, but also really hone in on the why and think about priorities. What's really important to Jill? In Jill's case, again, there were some conflicting issues. So she was due to marry. There was friction within the family. She had children from a previous relationship. She wanted to make sure that her assets were going to the correct people. She wanted to benefit other family members. So it was organising that into a clear structure and prioritising that information. So my top tips for support then: dive into the why, to what's really driving us to make the will and power of attorney. The DIY approach will ultimately cost money in the long run, a lot of the time. So it needs to be tailored. And then think about, well, I mentioned earlier, what's really important, because they are very individualistic, wills and powers of attorney. The generic advice won't relate to your circumstances. And also just keep in mind the importance of what we're doing and the most important legal service we will ever use. So that was the end of part 2. And once you've done all that, this is when you can look at making the decision. So putting it all together, putting it into action. So how can we actually make the will and make the power of attorney? The truth is, so most do take a shortcut. I talked about that earlier with the DIY approach, or possibly substandard options. And then that leads to not taking the legal advice we need, thinking it's simple, and it doesn't get the attention it really deserves to make that difference in our life. Linking to the important conversations and how, we really engage with death, we can live our best life. But instead, think about the process. So we can use this process to really get this done, take action. And it's best to illustrate it. And this is what I did with Steve and Sue, another example from clients I've helped. Again, not real clients' names. A lot of the circumstances are from, lots of clients I've helped, in the past. And with Steve and Sue, so unmarried partners, had children from previous relationships, had assets which were jointly owned and solely owned, had extended families, were business owners. They really needed to think about personal possessions, but also their social media and their online assets. All of these things going on. And then with a combination of bringing all this information together, planning stage, initial fact find, and then also one-to-one support, we were actually able to uncover the why. So what was the driving force and why it was important to Steve and Sue to make the will and powers of attorney? We took all these steps together through one-to-one support, and we were able to work out whether there was any inheritance tax to pay. We could see what assets were part of the will. So did we need to make any changes to our assets were owned to protect them or to save tax? So for example, if we do have jointly owned assets, do we need to think about what we need to do? Consider the structure. How are we actually going to make best use of these protections? And also consider what will happen to the business if they were to pass away, if they became ill, who was actually going to look after it? And then the importance of the family tree. And I mentioned earlier, drawing out your own family tree, such a useful exercise, because it does enable you to get a full picture of exactly who your loved ones are, but there could be other family members you might want to include or you might want to exclude. And this will give you the kind of visualization of that and help you to identify, work out who's going to get what, work out who's going to be good, who's going to be good at being my attorney, who is actually going to do what I want them to do, and who's going to follow my wishes. So a really useful exercise to do. And that will help when it comes to pulling all of this together. The steps we took together with the powers of attorney, so similar to the will, going through our fact find and our one-to-one support. So business planning, I've mentioned, was really important. Considering how the attorneys are going to act for them, making sure that they weren't overburdened, but they knew what they were going to do. And then also planning out who could actually make those medical decisions, those important decisions, and in some cases, life-sustaining treatment decisions. So what do we want to happen if we do reach end of life? And also, another step was the digital assets. Sometimes this gets overlooked. And again, it's something I do notice often, perhaps when clients come to me, they've made a DIY will, or they want to update the will, to really think about your social media accounts. How can you protect them? Think about all your digital assets. You'll have lots of them. So again, it's noting that down, just a quick few minutes, just thinking about that, and then incorporating that into the process of making the will and power of attorney. Actually, let me know so I do have an ultimate guide to protecting your digital assets and memories. If that'll be useful, let me know in the chat, because I can send a copy. So all of this work that we did together enabled us to draw up the will specifically for Steve and Sue, so that they knew everything was catered for. They knew that they were going to have peace of mind. They had all the correct documentation in place. Their assets and family were secure. Their wishes were recorded. Such a key point. They were going to go to the correct people, so the assets were passing to who Steve and Sue had specified. We'd considered tax mitigation. We made sure that the correct people could make those important financial and health-related decisions. Business side could continue to operate, and their finances were in order. And also less stress. Again, that comes up often with helping clients. It's almost a weight off their shoulders. And you become more open about this stuff. It's something I've certainly experienced over the years. It's fair to say with the work I do, I've made many, many wills in the past. But it really does open up your discussions and thinking about it in a good way. So a few yeses to the digital assets guide. So that's fantastic. I'll send out a copy of that because clients have said it's, again, something which is really useful, particularly for social media accounts. Okay, so in addition, so all that work we did together, the other thing that we considered was updating the will. So I've talked a little bit about making sure you keep the will updated. So there was a free review included, so they could contact me within 2 years just to see, are there any tweaks needed? An opportunity to review if there's been any change in circumstances, or just to double check, make sure it's still what we need. It does what we want it to do. So that was also included. So top tips for decisions. So again, thinking about the why, focusing on the good things in life will, by getting the process right, that will allow you to engage with death and ultimately live our best life, because that's what we want to do. Peace of mind does genuinely come from the correct advice and tailor approach. So stay away from our DIY options. And then, as I've mentioned, things will change. So if you can update it every 2 years, it doesn't necessarily mean there will be changes, but it's good to review it, every year if you can. But, timing can obviously be a problem. There's always lots of things going on. So for peace of mind, protection and security, this is for assets, for our loved ones, for our business. We want that tailored solution and advice. We want to make sure that there are no mistakes, so we don't have to worry. People that we do leave behind, there isn't a mess to sort out. Follow this process, and then we're not leaving it to chance. So I mentioned earlier the opportunity to book in a call with me. So if this does sound just for you, perfect for you, an opportunity to delve into this process, you would really like some personal help and support, let's have a conversation around, find out some more information. And we'll actually talk through on the call. So exact circumstances, let's get some clarity on what you actually need. Let's pinpoint the why, because if we get the why right, then then it flows naturally from there. We can make an action plan, and then we can actually start things moving and work towards peace of mind. So let's follow the process. And there's just some examples here of lots of clients I've helped in the past, getting all their wills, powers of attorney in place, and having that personal support. So I have offered and made available calls. So there are 10 calls available. It is first come, first served. So again, you can use the QR code there, which will take you to a link to the booking in page. So use your camera to point at the screen, and that will take you through to the booking page. If not, reach out to me, then we can get something booked in. I can email over a link as well. There is actually a link on the next slide, which is just there at the bottom, as well, if you want to take a note of that. I'll just pop the QR code back up on the screen. Oh, actually, there we go. There's both of them. So there's an opportunity there to book in a call. As I mentioned earlier, you know, I think sometimes there is this misconception of you know, we need to do this in later life. But it's just as important to think about, you know, no matter what, in all honesty, no matter what our age, you know, we don't know what's around the corner. I certainly don't. So if we can really plan, then, you know, that is the way forward. So yeah, we are running over time a bit, so I will take some questions, and I know there's some questions been put into the chat. So feel free to stay on the session. I will be here for another 10 minutes or so. If anyone does need to go, no problem. Hopefully that's been helpful. So thank you for joining, and thank you so much for all your comments. That's really good to see. So for those who do and are able to stay for 10 minutes, I'm just going to have a look through for the questions. And if there are any other particular questions you want to ask, then feel free to pop them in the chat now for me. So let's just have a look at what we have here, questions wise. There's some really good points coming in with the questions, some really useful points raised. So let's have a look. So yeah, question here about assisting. So thank you, Chuck. So assisting with the documents, absolutely. So as I mentioned, helping clients put all these protections into place. You know, part of it is ultimately about the legal side, which are the documents. But I think, you know, as I mentioned earlier, it is just so much more than that, and just, you know, thinking about what we can actually do, what's important to you, what do we need to actually get it tailored for us. So a question here from Lee: how can you ensure your family receive what's left to them if you die before your partner? Yes, that is a great question. And the truthful answer is making the will. So the great thing about wills is that they are so flexible, and I mean, it's so fascinating when you think about it, how people can sometimes think they're quite simple. It does amaze me sometimes, but there are trusts you can put into a will which can help protect other family members, you know, and particularly if you die before a partner. So part of that is planning. So again, working out how that might look like for you, and then structuring the will so you can ring mark assets. And usually you would do that through the use of a trust, and there are various different trusts you can use to make that happen. So really great question. It's worth probably noting as well, a letter of wishes is a useful way to record and make sure that everybody knows how the trust is going to operate. So that also sits behind the will. So, oh yeah, I just noticed a comment from Paul actually mentioned that this should be covered by the will. So yeah, absolutely. So thank you for that question. Again, such a useful one and a common point. So another question here. So if both parents die, how old does one of the remaining children need to be to have custody of younger siblings? Yes, so age is actually 18. So again, a really important point, appointing guardians for young children in a will. So if something happens to both parents, there are family members or siblings, whoever it may be, who can look after younger children, but it's only for those who are 18 and under. So a guardian can only be appointed for somebody who is 18, sorry, younger than 18, so a minor. And I was just thinking then, actually, it's a really good point, because if you then have, perhaps older children who might need looking after, that's when you can start to introduce trust in your will, but also powers of attorney can be really helpful if you want to make sure that, children, it might be they have struggles for whatever reason, it could be financial reasons, it could be relationship difficulties, and that's when powers of attorney can help as well. So another question here from Gillian: friends and family aren't suitable trustees to manage finances. Who can use instead to oversee the sale of a house, etc., when we die? So yeah, it's again such a good point, and that that comes. So this choice of executors in a will. So who's going to deal with the will? Who's going to deal with your assets when you die? Those are called the executors, and attorneys under the power of attorney. So who are the people who are going to make decisions and possibly make financial decisions and, help with other medical health related issues. So it could be that you appoint a professional, and that is something I often see where people are worried about family and friends. Comes back to the burden point as well. If you've got professionals who can help and actually be appointed as executors in a will, or even as a professional attorney, then that can be so helpful. A lot of the time, people will appoint friends and family. This does happen quite often. I will say yes, it's okay to do that, but it's just choosing them wisely. So it's really thinking at the planning stage, using your family tree, who are going to be suitable. Are they willing to do it? So talking to them. There could be circumstances where it's completely, it's not going to work and it's unsuitable for friends and family. But people do appoint friends and family. So it's just thinking it through. And it might be that you think about a professional. It could be that you have professional people in your life, for an accountant's a good example, who may be willing to do it as well. But solicitors certainly do that role. So the question from Lee was asking about certificate providers. Yeah, good point. And so are the certificate provider and powers of attorney two different people? Yes, absolutely. Certificate provider has to be someone completely separate from anybody else mentioned in the power of attorney. And that's why it's good if you're having professional advice, a solicitor, so myself, can be the certificate provider. Great question. Just seeing if there's any more questions. Thanks for those who've managed to stay on. Really grateful for that. And oh yes, Lee, I think we've got another question here. So, I love these questions, by the way. Thank you so much. So, Lee, what if one partner needs to live in the home after the other dies, but the deceased family is due to benefit from the property? Oh, goodness me, yes. In all honesty, this is a tricky one to unpick, and it does happen surprisingly often. I see this a lot. Now, the first thing I would say, and I know this isn't directly answering the question, but this is a great example of why planning is so important. And sometimes people may have put plans into place and they haven't been right. Again, from my experience, that could be because it's DIY. It could be that they have unfortunately taken the wrong advice and taken a substantial option. So that's the first point. So I'm just going to take a sip of water. Just bear with me. I'll give you a chance now just to just to reflect and make any notes from those questions. Oh, excuse me. Too much talking, not enough water. So, yeah, what could we do in this situation? So we've got one partner, excuse me, living in the home. The deceased family is due to benefit. So there are, I mean, ultimately, it will depend on. So if there's a will, it's going to depend on what the will says. That's your first starting point. If there isn't a will, then that's when the law is going to set out, well, what exactly is going to happen. So you are then kind of bound by what the law says. The other options which may be available are going to be things like a reorganization post death. So you can make alterations to how an estate is distributed, whether that's under a will or whether that's through intestacy. So the rules which set out, well, this is what happens if I don't have a will or an invalid will. You can change that post death, and that can be done by, so usually the executors, if there's a will, sorry, I should say the beneficiaries, so the people who are affected are going to be affected by any changes that are being made. So that's one way of approaching it. Problem with that is, usually in these situations, that there are difficult relationships within the family. If there isn't, great, then that could be an option, and you can discuss it, and everybody will be happy to come to some kind of arrangement. Again, depending on the circumstances, it is going to be very much about the individual circumstances in terms of what you can do, but there are certain family rights. So there are, again, laws which dictate what can happen in certain situations where you are living in a property, or maybe that you have some interest in the property. So sometimes it happens that a partner is living in a house which is owned by their partner who's died, but they have contributed, whether that's to a mortgage, whether that's to the upkeep, whatever it may be. So there are some rights that they may have, and also some matrimonial rights as well. So it is a complicated question to answer, because it will depend on the individual circumstances, but that's given some food for thought, maybe. And so let's just have a look. Oh, yes. So Liz also mentioned, so if you both have family want to split it 50-50 to each side after the partner dies. So, yeah, I mean, you can certainly do that with the will, split it 50-50. This is when, because you're then going to have two options there. One is that you rely on trust. So whoever dies first, you need to be able to trust them that they're not going to change the will. So it all goes, 100% goes to their side of the family. Or that's when you're going to introduce a trust into the will, and that's going to protect your half. I'll give a good example, which often comes up with clients I help. So property, you own your home and it's owned jointly. Usually that's 50-50, not always, because you can own a property in different shares depending on how much you've put into the property. But if it's 50-50, you then might want to say in the will, I'm going to leave my 50% share of the property to my side of the family. But the will's also going to say, well, whilst my partner, if you die first, is still alive, they could also remain living in the property. So that the partner will be protected because they'll have rights over your half of the property. They actually own, they still got, if it's jointly, they're still going to own 50% anyway. But they've got that protection embedded in the will. But then when the second partner dies, it will, so the 50% or the first to die will go to their own family. So that's where you can make use of a trust. Really important to get advice for that, professional advice when you're doing that, because it also comes down to, if it is a jointly owned property, you need to make sure that the property is owned in such a way that you can leave it in the will. So there are different ways you can jointly own a property, and the distinction is what happens on death. So really, really important to get legal advice in those situations, because you may need to do some changes, you may need to make some changes to the way the property is owned in order for the will to work. So definitely protections you can do. Does that answer the question, Lee, to an extent? Lovely, thank you. Thank you for those questions. Really, really important points. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this session. Thanks so much for those who have continued to stay on the session. Great to have you with me this morning. And do reach out if you'd like to book one of those calls. There will be a recording available of this session, which I will send out shortly after today. So watch out for that if that's something that you would like to see. It might be useful. So I will be circulating that. But for now, thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of the day, enjoy the rest of the week. Hopefully the weather's not going to be too bad wherever you are. And take care for now.